Okay, so in this particular chapter section, we're going to be talking more about Freudian theories of personality. Keep in mind as we're going through this that Freud is presenting a single perspective of personality, and there are some other perspectives. We're going to spend a little bit of time in another video talking about trait personality theory, which is more where I'm housed and where I was trained. And keep in mind the goal of this, to learn a little bit more about Freud's theories of personality so that we can better understand psychoanalysis when we talk about therapies later. So we're going to start with the structure of mind and structure of self, and then move on to what drives and motivates us, and then talk a little bit more about what makes us unique according to Freudian theory. On a side note, you also have access to some primary resources. You can read one of Freud's own dream analyses, and I'm asking you to do that as part of your materials for this week. So go ahead and check out that uploaded document and see what you think about Freud's dream analysis. We're also going to talk just a little bit about some of the challenges and critiques presented when talking about Freud, because it's important to put him into a greater context. So to start with the structure of the mind, according to Freud, we had the preconscious, the conscious, and the unconscious. So you can think of the preconscious mind as being at a level of not quite conscious awareness, but something that can slip into conscious awareness fairly easily. So if you're not actively tracking something and doing it a little mindlessly, you might think of that as being in your preconscious. Your conscious mind is when you're fully aware and tracking your surroundings and paying attention to it. And your unconscious would be below your level of awareness. One of the pictures that's often used when describing these different things is an iceberg, where you think of the conscious mind as being above the waterline, the preconscious mind as being right at the waterline, and the unconscious mind is descending deep below the surface of the water in a far vaster bulk than what you see above the water. According to Freud, the unconscious was the most important part of our mind and the part that he wanted to pay the most attention to. This is also the hardest for us to access because it is below our level of awareness. And that also makes it very challenging to study and to measure scientifically. Freud also had a structure of the self. So let's go ahead and go through these different things. There's the id, which is present at birth and completely exists in our unconscious. So we think of our id as being I think of the id as our inner toddler, as something that wants and is constantly looking for fulfillment and gratification and doesn't really care about consequences. Freud was the one who termed the word libido to refer to sexual energy specifically, but also just general energy that is inappropriate to express in social circumstances and in society. You can think of the id as functioning based on the pleasure principle. I want it and I want it now, right? So the id would be focusing on achieving pleasure without necessarily focusing in on the consequences of that pleasure. The superego is the part of our personality that is our moral center. So if we think of our id as our inner toddler, you can think of the superego as the angel on our shoulder, right? Or the Jiminy Cricket if you're a fan of the classic Pinocchio video. So this represents what our self should be under ideal circumstances, when we're following all the rules and aligning with society. It represents our conscience, which is different from our conscious. Our consciousness is our state of awareness and awakeness. Our conscience is our sense of morals and right and wrong. And once again, our superego functions as our morality principle, or our ought principle, what we ought to be doing, how we ought to behave. So our superego is telling us, here are the rules of society, and here's what you should do in order to be a good member of that society. The ego falls in the middle, and whereas the id is fully unconscious, and the superego is a little externally placed because that's usually determined by society and our awareness of the rules of society. Our ego is our sense of self that we are fully, or rather mostly conscious of. So our ego is a state of consciousness. It's our rational and logical self. And it is basically our realistic approach to navigating through the needs of the id and the rules of the superego. So you think of the ego as a grand compromiser where it serves as an in-between. The id says, I want this, I want it now. The superego says, that's against the rules. The id has to navigate between the two and find a compromise. I'm a little bummed. One of the things I was going to have you do is act out different skits in front of the class like we've been doing so far this semester. And one of the things people have done in the past when portraying the ego in a skit is they'll have the ego making the id and superego shake hands, for example. So you can just kind of imagine that and think through how you might design a little skit to represent the balance between the id, ego, and superego. Now, it's funny because we use ego these days to indicate someone who's a little full of themselves. So, for example, the villain in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, which was excellent, by the way, was named Ego, and he had a very powerful sense of self to the point where he was a narcissist, and he tried to take over the universe. But Freud's initial conception of ego was it was our sense of self, and that it was important to have a strong ego in order to maintain control over our sense of self, and that often when people were experiencing challenges, that it was because their ego wasn't strong enough. So whereas we tend to use, oh, they have such an ego these days as a put down, I would say that the Freudian conception of ego is that it's important to have a strong sense of self. And the ego functions once again based on the reality principle. Here's what I want, here's what I need to do to fulfill society's rules, what can I do that is realistic? So I can't get a cookie now, but I can get a cookie later. Or instead of a cookie, I can eat a carrot, to find a way to navigate through the real world. So in addition to the structure of mind and the structure of self, we were also going to talk about drives and motivations. So according to Freud, our unconscious desires drive us and determine what it is that we seek. And that these things that we're driven by are often incredibly socially inappropriate and potentially sources of shame, stress, and anxiety because they are inappropriate. So Freud tended to focus a lot on sexual desire. That's what he's kind of known for. And according to Freud, when someone would experience inappropriate sexual desire, they would suppress it and kind of push it down and try not to think about it because it would go against the rules of society. It's also important to remember the society that Freud was living in was incredibly structured, and there were all sorts of rules. The number of rules, for example, that single women in society, so high society of Vienna, were placed under were incredible. The sorts of people they could talk to and shouldn't talk to, the sorts of clothes they had to wear, the sorts of parties they needed to attend and shouldn't attend, the way they dressed, the way they held their fan, all of that was very much something that was very structured. And also there were all sorts of rules about how men and women needed to behave around one another when it came to premarital sex. Oh, it's my cat saying hello. That's Sansa telling howdy. All right, she's trying to get in my lap now. All right, here she goes. So, according to Freud, these unconscious desires can lead to irrational behavior. So whenever somebody would behave in a way that hurts them or appears to be completely like baffling, why would you do that? Why would you make that decision? Why would you hurt yourself in that way? Freud would say that it stems from that unconscious drive and desire that is shameful and that we don't think about because it's shameful, and that we can have defense mechanisms which distort reality for us. So he would look to see if he can figure out the root of irrational behavior, and he identified various patterns in terms of the defense mechanisms that people can come up with. And looking at something like a dream would be a way to gain insight into these desires. So when I'm asking you to look at Freud's initial analysis of his own dream, Freud would say that this is the way to tap into the unconscious. Now, you can critique Freud's dream, and I want you to, and his analysis of it, but this would be something that would be important to Freud, and according to Freud, the way for us to understand that unconscious drive and desire. He would also observe subtle unconscious behaviors. For example, when people would avoid talking about something or stutter or stumble over their words, use one word instead of another, he would think that that would be an insight into what they were currently struggling with in the unconscious because they were trying to repress it and they were engaging in defense mechanisms. We'll go through some specific defense mechanisms in a little bit. Here we go. So here's some defense mechanisms that Freud identified. So first of all, there's the general notion of repression. When you're repressing something, you're pushing it down into your unconscious and burying it. This requires a certain degree of psychic energy. And once again, according to Freud, the process of repression can lead that energy to pop out in unexpected ways that you could actually observe and measure to gain insight into what was going on. So for example, one of the things that could happen as a result of repression is something called projection. Projection is where you basically see the thing that you hate most about yourself in someone else. So if you are being overly judgmental of another person, and saying, oh man, like Susan is so disorganized, she drives me nuts. That could actually be stemming from your own insecurity about how you feel about your level of disorganization, but you're unwilling to look yourself in the mirror, so you're seeing it in someone else instead because it's easier. Reaction formation is where you form an emotional reaction that is the opposite of the threatening or unacceptable thoughts. So this is one of those cases of the lady doth protest too much, meaning that sometimes when someone goes on and on about how moral they are and how important it is for them to be moral, sometimes what they're hiding is a thought that they would otherwise find threatening or unacceptable. Once again, this is according to Freud. So there was a really interesting study that was done in the 90s by a researcher called Adams. I actually have my theories of personality students read the study. And in the Adams study, what they did was they measured people's levels of homophobia, specifically men. They measured how homophobic men were, and men who identified as straight. And then they showed them various forms of pornography. And what they were able to establish in the study is that men who rated high in homophobia also were more aroused by gay porn. Now, they also said that they weren't as aroused as the measurements found that they were. And Adams claimed that that was an example of evidence for reaction formation. Now, you can critique the heck out of the Adams study, and I've done that. For example, you can say that arousal can be for a variety of responses, not just actually being sexually attracted to the thing that you're watching, but also as a reaction of defense. So there's that. But anyways, that would be an example of how people in the past have attempted to test reaction formations about how someone might claim to hate gay people, but might secretly have some attractions that they're trying to press down and hide. And I would like to once again specify that this is a Freudian perspective. This isn't necessarily my own personal perspective or something that I adhere to. It's this particular set of belief systems around Freud. Okay. Sublimation would be where we turn socially unacceptable urges into socially acceptable behavior. So for example, someone who has a burst of creativity is potentially channeling that energy of their unacceptable unconscious desires into something that society would find acceptable, like a song or a painting. So that would be what Freud would deem sublimation. So the last thing we're going to talk about on this particular set of videos is what makes us unique. And according to Freud, early childhood was quite formative and an important marker of what made us individual, that our unique connections with our caregivers and childhood experiences in our early childhood, especially before the age of 4, was really very vital to sorting out how we ended up to be who we were as an adult and what sort of challenges and struggles we would have as an adult. According to Freud, once again, this is the Freudian perspective, children would go through various psychosexual stages as a part of their development and growth. And if the individual did not resolve the conflict that was present in a particular stage, then they would be what Freud would call fixated and stuck on certain traits and behaviors associated with that stage. So for example, we're going to go through the different psychosexual stages. If somebody is orally fixated, they might constantly be chewing on a pencil or eating food or smoking. Freud would determine that that person was stuck at the oral stage of that psychosexual stage, and that something had happened during that stage that made it difficult for them to move beyond it. So that would be fixation. Now, once again, talking about children and associating them with sexual pleasure and sexual stages does have a fair degree of controversy. Freud took a lot of heat for this, and more recent interpretations of Freudian theory have stepped away from the connection between these stages and sexual pleasure. So for example, Erikson's stages of development align very closely with Freud's, but Erikson's stages focus much more on social behavior rather than sexual pleasure. So for example, Freud would claim that during the oral stage, a child has sexual pleasure from putting things in their mouth and needs nourishment and food, and if that nourishment is not achieved, then the child has trust issues. Erikson called that very stage trust versus mistrust and talked about getting adequate nourishment from caregivers, but really shied away from talking about whether that was associated with sexual pleasure. So more modern versions of this particular approach to looking at stages of development really stepped back in a big way from talking about sexual pleasure in children because that was a bit controversial and also not necessarily an appropriate way to talk about what children experience. And, you know, it's just important to take Freud with a few grains of salt. Freud was a product of his time. He grew up in, well, I guess the most comparable thing to talk about would be the Victorian era, even though it wasn't the Victorian era in Viennese society, but in a particular time period where women didn't have a lot of rights. And one of the theories that he came up with was that women were constantly emotionally stunted and incapable of becoming fully recognized people because of their lack of a phallus. So you can take a look at that and go, oh God, Freud was such a misogynist, but also he was a product of a deeply misogynistic society. So he was surrounded by a culture that informed his opinions and beliefs, and it's important to take that with a grain of salt when you think about his theories. It's also important to understand that Freud was developing his theories during a time period where he didn't really have a lot of exposure to the tools of scientific method applied to human behavior. Psychology was very new as a science, and he didn't really know any better. So when he used a lot of things like dream analysis and didn't think about whether it was testable or not, that's because he didn't really have the language to apply it yet. He was just trying as best as he could based on what he had around him. So it's important not to necessarily dismiss all of what Freud had to say, but to interpret it through that cultural lens and to put him in that historical context. Freud did make an enormous contribution to developmental psychology, and that contribution was that children are indeed very different at different stages of their growth and development. Now, his interpretation of that difference might be something that you could debate, but his observations were still very keen and connected to what we see reflected in our current developmental stages. So Erikson's stages owe a lot to Freud and the field of developmental psychology and thinking about children as being different than adults, and 4-year-old children as different than 10-year-old children or different than 14-year-old children is actually really very valuable. And Freud was one of the first psychologists to really explore the fact that children were unique from adults and that they differed at different stages. Keep in mind that he was living in an era where we used to put 5-year-olds to work in coal mines, and we really didn't think of children as much different than miniature adults for a good long while. So this is a very important contribution to our field. And once again, even though his interpretation of what might be going on is definitely up for debate. So these psychosexual stages, I'm not going to spend too much time on them. And on a side note, usually I try to make these videos about shorter, but we're nearly done. So let's just go ahead and move our way through it. This should just take a few more minutes. So the oral stage goes from birth to about 18 months of age. And this would be where the mouth is a source of stimulation and comfort, and where access to nutrition is the source of conflict. This is also where the id is incredibly dominant, and people who get stuck on this phase would be what Freud would call having an oral fixation. The anal stage goes from 18 to 36 months. On a side note, this corresponds with when children go through potty training. So once again, his observations were fairly keen. According to Freud, this would be where the anus serves as a source of stimulation and pleasure, and where toilet training and control can be a source of conflict. And once again, toilet training can be a source of shame or guilt, and people could get stuck on it in terms of fixation. This is where the ego first develops. So this is where we start seeing a growth of a sense of self and identity in children. And on a side note, if you've ever heard the term anal retentive, that comes from Freud. According to Freud, people who got fixated at the anal stage could either be anal retentive or anal expulsive. Someone who's anal retentive would be someone who's very set in their ways and rigid, and wants to control everything, where someone who's anal expulsive, which is just a delightful phrase, is very messy and lacks control. So neat, fussy, and stingy versus messy, destructive, and hostile. The phallic stage would be the stage that lasts from 3 to 6 years of age. This is where children develop a sense of culture and society and the rules of culture and society. This is also when children start to develop a sense of gender identity and, according to Freud, their first sexual feelings. So I would also say, once again, staying with the theme of Freud's observations being very keen, this is the time where children start very much asserting their gender. So you might see children around 3 or 4 really performing their gender, insisting on wearing very, very, very frilly princess dresses, or playing with very, very, very masculine sorts of things. I want to play with this truck, and dolls are stupid, you know. So children very much assert their gender starting around this time of their development, and very much perform their gender in ways that might be a little bit over the top sometimes. My cousin Anya turned 4 and had a princess unicorn mermaid party, because that was just kind of where she was, and everything was just covered in glitter and sequins and bright, bright, bright pink and rainbowy, and that was just the best. This would also be, according to Freud, where children develop an Oedipus and Electra complex. Oedipus is based on the classic story Oedipus Rex, where a baby is born who is destined to kill his father and marry his mother. It's a Greek tragedy, and he does so, and then he blinds himself, and it's just a terrible tragedy. And Electra is his daughter. And according to Freud, children become initially attracted to the parent of the opposite gender and want to marry them. So children of this age will often say, oh, I want to marry my mom when I grow up, or I want to marry my dad when I grow up. And Freud interpreted that as initial sexual attraction, and then the children will model the same-sex parent to try to get their opposite sex parent as a partner later. And once again, this is a phase that children will often go through from 3 to 6, and Freud would see their statements of, I want to marry my mom, and he'd read into that as being that initial sexual attraction to the opposite sex parent and jealousy of the same sex parent. This is, once again, where children would adhere to gender norms in an attempt to model what they saw as the way to gain access to that opposite sex parent that they wanted to be with later. This would also be where female children develop penis envy, and once again, where females, when they grow up, are constantly stunted due to a lack of a phallus. This would be Freud's interpretation of what he saw as interpreting the women that he saw in his office and what sort of challenges they were going through. I would have a different interpretation. The latency stage is during pre-puberty, where children are going to school, where they're much more likely to think of, once again, in a heteronormative focus. All of this is very heteronormative, everybody. That's just what we get. Where children are much more likely to think of people of the opposite sex as gross. Oh, you got cooties, I'm not going to play with you, and you don't necessarily focus on sexual attraction. You develop in other ways. The genital stage would be during and after puberty, where sexual feelings reawaken with appropriate targets. So you're no longer attracted to the parent, you're attracted to your peer. So that would be Freud's interpretation of people moving through these different stages and his observations of children at these different stages and what they were going through.